Serverless was a really hot buzzword even before SST's lone marketer started making promotional videos. But usually whenever you hear someone talking about serverless, they're talking about AWS Lambda or Google Cloud Functions. The point being, they're talking about serverless compute. Serverless storage, on the other hand, was actually the first popular serverless offering. In fact, it's so popular and widely used that we barely even call it serverless anymore. I'm talking about AWS S3, Google Cloud Storage, Azure Blob Storage, those types of storage offerings. In fact, if we listen to that SST guy again, he has a really great definition of the term serverless.
For me, serverless pretty much means I'm paying for usage. Ideally, it scales to 0. So if I'm not using it, I'm paying 0. There's no like entry level cost. The more I use it, the more I pay. The less I use it, the less I pay.
So by that definition, that it scales to 0 and that you only pay for what you use, S3 is the perfect serverless offering, at least for storage. Now, there are a few benefits of these giant managed services using them for serverless storage. The first is massive scaling potential. It's very unlikely that your little app, I hope it's not that little, but it's very unlikely that your app is going to outscale the storage capabilities of something like S3. The second is availability. These massive cloud providers replicate their servers that run S3 and Google Cloud Storage and so on. They replicate them across many data centers. So even if one data center goes down or someone unplugs a cable, there's backups. So the data stays available and ready to use with very high uptime percentages. On that note, due to them replicating the data across data centers or across availability zones within the same region, the data is redundant and backed up. So you don't have to worry about losing the data because of one corrupted hard drive. Another benefit is you have little to no maintenance to do on the servers. Again, this is why it's called serverless. You don't have to manage the AWS S3 or the Google Cloud Storage servers. Yes, they exist, but they're somebody else's problem. If you need to upgrade an operating system on one of those boxes, you need a new version of Nginx, that's not something that you have to worry about. And then another benefit is just because we're operating at such massive scale with these products, it's just frankly pretty cheap when you only have to store a few things. It can get expensive, especially when you need high bandwidth over time, but it's still probably cheaper than you doing it yourself. I mean, usage isn't that expensive on these massive cloud providers. In my mind, the biggest drawback is vendor lock-in. So it makes a lot of sense to me if you're already running on AWS or GCP or Azure to just go ahead and use their storage offering. It's a pretty good serverless offering, but it might not make sense to jump to AWS if you're hosted elsewhere just for S3. So vendor lock-in is always a concern, but it's also always a trade-off and not necessarily a bad thing. Now, as far as using one of these products, the big difference is you don't think about it as your server's local file system anymore, like you would with a traditional file server. S3's architecture is, you treat S3 as what it is, which is someone else's API. You make network requests to S3 when you want to upload or download files to it, and your application server interacts with it as an external server, not like a traditional server would, where it would just go to its local disk to read image and video files. When you're working with local media files, the only thing you have to worry about is the file path. Where's my program running? Where are the files that I want to serve on disk? Whether that's an absolute or a relative file path. When working with S3, it's similar, but there's now two things you have to worry about. There's the bucket and there's the key, which you could basically think about as a file path. Buckets are globally unique identifiers. So you usually just set up a bucket for your project, or maybe your project might have multiple buckets if you've got a more sophisticated project that you're building. But then all you need is a key to be able to store and retrieve files. And this is typically done through your code, but one really cool part about these offerings is that when you add an object to one of these buckets and you make the bucket publicly accessible, someone can access your files directly through the API. In other words, S3 can be your media server. You don't need your server to proxy requests through to the bucket. You can let your application server worry about serving JSON. You can let S3 serve your media.